Right, so now if we take blood flowing into the body at the capillary level, so I'm going to draw a nice big long capillary over here, and now remember this is the smallest blood vessel in the body. So being a small blood vessel, I'm going to just put some red blood cells to give it some context. And there we have a red blood cell with a dimple. These are the tissues that you learnt about last year. There's another red blood cell with a dimple, and another red blood cell with a dimple. And let's put one over here just for good measure, a red blood cell with a dimple in it. So the blood cells can even flow in single file down that capillary. Now it's quite important for my diagram to put in the direction of blood flow. So I'm going to put a nice big arrow over there and a nice big arrow over there to try and illustrate the direction of blood flow. Now, if blood is coming from the heart, let's make it red because it's oxygenated blood, and it's going to leave the capillary and go back to the veins, and therefore it is now deoxygenated, so we give it the color blue. We need to consider the gases in the capillary, but before we do that we've got to say, what is the oxygen used for? Well, the capillary is flowing through tissue, so let's represent the tissue by some cells. Now this could be adipose tissue, this could be bone tissue. There's a cell with a nucleus, here's another cell with a nucleus, and there's another cell with a nucleus, and let's draw another cell over here with a nucleus. So all these cells, they need oxygen and they need to get rid of carbon dioxide. So if we consider the oxygen content of the blood coming in here, I'm going to give it a nice big O2 to represent a high concentration. And in the tissue, we've got a low concentrations of oxygen. So there's a diffusion gradient. We've got a high concentration of oxygen and a low concentration of oxygen. So oxygen is going to move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So as the oxygen gas comes down with the blood in the hemoglobin of the red blood cells, oxygen is going to move down a concentration gradient into the surrounding tissue. Oxygen is moving out into the surrounding tissue because these tissue cells need oxygen. So there comes the oxygen. And what will happen then is the oxygen content of the blood will be depleted. So that at the end here, we're going to have a relatively small oxygen content. So we started with a lot and we end with a little because a lot of it has diffused out of the blood into the surrounding tissue down a diffusion gradient from a high concentration to a low concentration until an equilibrium is reached, so that inside the blood the O2 levels are there and inside the tissue the O2 levels are equivalent. So that is how oxygen is moved from the blood into the tissue. It's down a concentration gradient for these cells that need the oxygen. So now, in the same way as the tissue needed oxygen, it also has to get rid of carbon dioxide. So let's represent the carbon dioxide as a high concentration in the surrounding tissue. So I'll write a big CO2 all the way around here, big CO2, representing a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the surrounding tissue. In the blood that's coming down, in the arterial blood, highly oxygenated blood, the CO2 levels are relatively low. So let's write that down over here. The CO2 levels are low because most of that carbon dioxide was released in the lungs to the atmosphere. So now with a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the tissue and a low carbon dioxide concentration in the blood, there's going to be a carbon dioxide gradient. So carbon dioxide is going to move down a gradient from a high concentration to a low concentration. So carbon dioxide is going to move into the blood. Now it moves mostly into the plasma part of the blood. So there we go. Just for simplicity's sake, carbon dioxide is moving in. The carbon dioxide has been manufactured by these cells as a byproduct of cellular respiration. So that now, by the time the blood leaves the capillary, it is now relatively high in carbon dioxide. Where it started in as being quite low, it is now quite high. It's also just interesting to know that it'll be at equilibrium, pretty much the same as the tissue, surrounding tissue carbon dioxide concentrations. So we've now had the exchange of gases. We've had oxygen coming in and oxygen moving into the surrounding tissue. We've had carbon dioxide moving from the surrounding tissue into the blood. Where the oxygen levels started high, by the time they get to the vein, they're relatively low. Where the converse is true for the carbon dioxide. It starts relatively low and it ends up becoming relatively high. So that is the movement of gases in and out of the blood vessel. But there's more. Very, very importantly, there is water. Now, water levels are high in the blood. Because it's a liquid, it's mostly the plasma is made up of water. And what happens is almost all of this water is actually going to move out of the blood into the surrounding tissue. Can you see my arrow directions? This water is going to move out into the surrounding tissue. And with that water comes dissolved food. Now that dissolved food represents all the stuff that your digestive system managed to digest and absorb into the blood supply, glucose, amino acids, and many more. These foods and water are needed by the cells. So it literally moves out of the capillaries into the surrounding tissue. The cells take up the water and they take up the food. And then what's interesting is that most of that water gets returned back into the blood supply. So by the time the blood leaves the tissue, the water levels are just as high as they were when they came in. But there's something else. From the cells comes metabolic waste. And metabolic waste are those waste products made by the cell. Besides carbon dioxide, there are other metabolic wastes, things like urea, which is toxic to the cells. It needs to get rid of the urea. So urea is going to be taken up by the blood, and this is becoming quite messy, but that's okay because you've understood it along the way. And by the time the blood comes out, the water levels remain the same, and now we have metabolic waste being taken up by the blood, and that gets circulated back towards the heart. So it's very important to realize what's going on at the capillary level. There's gaseous exchange, there's the diffusion of dissolved foods out of the blood into the surrounding tissue, and there's the taking up of waste from the tissue into capillaries to be returned back into circulation. What's also very important to know is that these capillaries, being a single-celled, thick squamous epithelium, leak lots and lots of water into the surrounding tissue, and that's very, very important. But most of that water gets taken up back into the blood supply, and so we don't lose or gain much water at the tissue level. However, what happens is if we don't take up all that excess water, we have a surplus of water at the tissue level, the tissue is going to swell. And that leads us on to the next system of the lymphatic system.